District of Conservation is sponsored by the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, better known as CFACT. To learn more about our sponsor, head over to cfact.org. Thanks for listening to the program. Welcome to District of Conservation. I'm your host, Gabriella Hoffman. This podcast offers a sober examination into all things hunting, fishing, shooting sports, energy, environment, and the public policy surrounding it. And this podcast also specializes in original interviews that you won't hear elsewhere. Here's what I have for you today. As we round out the year and enter the Christmas season, I have a few more episodes to publish before the new year commences. And today I want to focus on two slightly different topics, but I want to kind of ruminate and reflect on the conclusion of one of my favorite shows. If you're a longtime listener, you know that I'm a big fan of the Yellowstone series. I was an early adopter, and it's a bittersweet time with the show finally concluding. And then I want to do a tale of two countries with respect to gun rights, kind of looking from the outside into two countries, Canada and Poland. Canada is restricting more civilian firearms under the guise of protections, and this is coming on the heels of Justin Trudeau possibly being forced to resign because he has lost the confidence of his people. And then alternatively, Poland is starting to enact mandatory firearms training in elementary schools, grade school. I think it extends through middle school, high school as well. And you see countries without Second Amendments and how they approach personal safety and whatnot. So we'll explore that as well. But a little bit of Yellowstone, and then I want to talk about those two countries in the framework of a good path to go down and a bad path to pursue. With respect to Yellowstone, I have never gravitated to TV series. I'm probably an oddball American where I try not to consume my time with innocuous content. But then again, I'm a news junkie, so I watch the news and I like to watch movies. But I've never really was a series type of gal. I never gravitated to shows much growing up. I never watched reality TV with the exception of the Real Housewives series because that was in my backyard. Safe to say I lost a few brain cells watching that program growing up. But outside of that, I tried not to consume silly content, and there was never really TV shows that I gravitated towards. I liked This Is Us for a time. I thought there were some overtones that were relatable, and then I found the show kind of boring into the third, fourth seasons. And then around the time of my waning interest in that program in This Is Us came Yellowstone. I was drawn to the program because, of course, Kevin Costner was included, and I don't agree with his politics, but he's a great actor. He's a legendary actor, and so he was a draw for me. The advertising on Paramount TV was enough to lure people like me into the program. I liked some of the elements that they were showing. The advertising really hooked you in. The aesthetics were beautiful. The cinematography was gorgeous. So I wanted to give Yellowstone a chance. This was in summer 2018 when it first premiered. So the premiere night, I tuned in, I watched with an open mind, and even with all the drama and pomp and circumstance, I was really drawn to the show. I loved the themes that were communicated throughout the series, and I waited in anticipation for every new series to drop. I think it was first like Saturdays, and then they moved it to Sundays, which I actually thought was great because like a lot of Sunday night programming is very dull and boring. A lot of recycling of different TV programs. So Sunday nights for me across these last 6.5 years, even with the gap period of Yellowstone, became Yellowstone nights. I would anticipate different episodes. I would watch with curiosity. I would want to have more because I felt like the episodes didn't go far enough or didn't go long enough. And early on in the program, as I've articulated here on the podcast, there were so many themes to conservation, this show in particular, that really were communicated well by Taylor Sheridan. He really gets what time it is, as some people say. He knows what time it is with respect to this. And I think some of the early criticisms he received was that this is a conservative prestige drama TV. I remember TV Guide had stated that. There was a lot of left-wing criticism of the program because of so-called toxic masculinity themes, animal cruelty accusations, treatment of women in certain regards, or like this machismo and this endorsement of hunting and killing of grizzly bears and management of wolves, but also interspersed with some of these more controversial questions of, do you manage grizzly bears? Yes, you do. And there were some of the drawbacks listed to that, and Sheridan would intersperse and weave in the complexities of conservation policy, why an outdated law or a law that hasn't been modernized like the Endangered Species Act and other laws can complicate management, put people, especially out west in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, on high alert. Water rights, threats of overdevelopment, threats of government overreach. That's something that we witness very frequently, especially under Democratic administrations with respect to the conservation question. And even positively, I think if you were watching the show and the different scenarios and the different types of characters and perspectives that were shown, you could see that Taylor Sheridan even accounted for the preservationist wing of conservationism. He accounted for developers who want to privatize everything and kind of despoil the area. He also talked about government encroachment and abuse by local, state, and federal law enforcement officers who would make it complicated to have property rights. So the real world application of certain policy challenges and conservation were very evident in Yellowstone. And you could even see this kind of in the spin-offs as well. Granted, there were a lot of dramatic scenes that are not really based in reality. That's the Hollywood effect for you. You have to have some enticements, some sensual content, some drama, some violence. That's just how you keep people hooked in, because if you make it strictly like a policy wonk show, no one's going to be interested in that. So you have to add some spice, and that's what Taylor Sheridan did. Sometimes to the point of being preposterous at times. I think around the end of season 4, in the beginning of season 5, I wouldn't say like the story writing got a little sloppy, but it seemed very protracted and extended and kind of lost his way. There was a criticism of whether Taylor Sheridan was inserting too much of his spin-offs and other side projects into Yellowstone, detracting from the intent of the program. Maybe it lost its luster. I'd seen some criticism of people saying it was detracting from the original show, and that, especially with this season 5 part B, a lot of people were very disinterested in the program, and then they came around to liking the season finale or the series finale again because it went back to its roots. So again, a lot of criticism. And I think you could also learn something new from this. So with respect to Native American relationships, and I don't agree with rewilding. I have some criticisms of, I wouldn't say that perspective, for instance, but not every Native American, as anyone learns, is for preservationism. Not all of them are progressive. Not all of them are against oil and gas. A lot of them support hunting and fishing too. So I thought Taylor Sheridan's interweaving of different Native perspectives. Granted, he showed that a lot of Native Americans, especially in the contemporary times, did not like oil and gas projects, had some criticisms of different things, but they were able to work with the Dutton family, as you'll see in the season finale and the season as the show culminates, because they had a lot more in common than they had not. But if you look at that Native American perspective, and especially with this 1923 spinoff, I think people like me who didn't know much about this history, and I think Taylor Sheridan did this with Wind River, and I watched Wind River as this series was starting to come online. I think it was during COVID, and I was bored like everyone else, stuck and trapped in my house. I wanted to watch Wind River to kind of understand Taylor Sheridan more, and I appreciated that he brought this perspective about missing Native American women and children, because this is a serious problem, and the federal government is at the behest of this, and local governments don't have jurisdiction over this, so it makes it all the more complicated. And during the first Trump administration, I remember when one episode about missing Native American women and children came out on Yellowstone, it was actually coincidentally timed with an initiative from the Trump administration to address this issue. And you don't think Republican administrations do this, but it was happening under, I believe it was President Trump's daughter, Ivanka Trump, had spearheaded this initiative with the Department of Interior, or helped to kind of spotlight this more. I think Taylor Sheridan's show not only showed the cowboy way of life, the understanding and dynamics of conservation issues, the need to reform certain outdated or really antiquated laws, but even to spotlight some really ugly history in the United States. And I think everyone can agree that a lot of these Indian schools were horrible. If you've watched anything of Taylor Sheridan, whether it was the Yellowstone spinoffs or Wind River, or just know a little bit about Native American history, that was a pretty bad blemish. And I thought that him showcasing this and why they have certain perspectives and beliefs, but they're not a monolith at the same time, and that they want to be part of the American fabric. They have the same challenges like non-Indigenous or non-Native American people. And I thought Taylor Sheridan, like I said, with the season finale, showed that there was a lot more in common between the Dutton family and one of the tribes that are portrayed than is usually made out to be in the real world, that there's always this constant conflict. But that's not true, because as I've documented here, there have been a lot of different areas where Native Americans have worked with those who may disagree with them or may have a different perspective from them for conservation issues, for energy development. It's not a monolith. It's not just one monolithic perspective. And that's what I appreciated. But we have even so-called people on the right were saying that the show became wokeified and detracted from its mission statement. And this sounds like someone who's never watched an episode of Yellowstone. This is some conspiracy theorist. I won't lend credibility to his name. You guys probably know who it is, but I try not to elevate these kinds of people, reactionaries, even from the right. As a conservative, I don't think it's conducive to really do that. But this one individual was complaining about the program being woke and having lost its way, and that's a horrible way to, conclude the series. And this person said the series end of Yellowstone went completely woke and had the Duttons returning their land back to the Indians. Shout out to those of us who saw this coming. Yellowstoning was always about pacing and leading conservative audiences to wokeness. Taylor Sheridan sold out. And if you've seen any interviews he's done with Joe Rogan, even some of these like Hollywood blogs and websites, you don't see him come across as woke whatsoever. He's a storyteller. He has to portray all perspectives. That's what a objective storyteller who's effective does. And it's left to the audiences to interpret whether it is woke or not. But if you watch Yellowstone closely, the spinoffs closely, and any other project he does, you don't detect a trace of wokeness whatsoever. I don't know how you could deduce this, but let's talk about the series finale that this individual is pointing out. And he's saying, well, returning back to the natives, it's terrible. But if you were watching the program in some of the spinoffs, this was prophesied. And ultimately, this was the most logical conclusion, with Kevin Costner being out of the picture. I don't know how much longer he would have stayed in the program if there would have been another season, had that drama between him and Taylor Sheridan not transpired, and that 2-year gap period either. Would things have ended differently? Maybe. But Kevin Costner's character was always kind of doomed to die. That's what I remember from reading the analysis of the series, just what I could extrapolate from watching the show. But to call this gesture wokeness when you didn't even understand the finale or pay attention closely. So there's a scene, okay, this is a spoiler. If you haven't watched it yet, I apologize. But there's a scene after they return the Yellowstone to this tribe, the Yellowstone Ranch. You see that these younger Native Americans are defiling gravestones, including that of John Dutton. And one of the right-hand men of the tribal leader reprimands these children, these younger people, saying, hey, what are you doing? We promised to safeguard and protect the Dutton family legacy. You shouldn't be turning over their gravestones. So I don't know how that is woke. If you watch the series finale, you would not even be able to deduce that it's woke whatsoever. I thought that kind of goes against the grain of what people think the Native American perspective is, to hate others. But like I said, there's a lot more nuance with respect to this. I'm not an expert in Native American relations. I don't claim to be, but from my understanding and what I've seen transpire even in public policy, that it's a lot more nuanced than possible. And like I said, if you watch the show, you realize that the intention of Taylor Sheridan was to show that there was a lot more commonality between the Dutton family and these Native Americans compared to developers, the federal government, and these other threats that were posed to the Yellowstone and that region, even as fictionalized as it is. That situations are a lot more harmonious in real life than made out to be in TV, in that people have to work together. And so that's why I appreciated Yellowstone so much, because it showed that people have to, there are strange bedfellows you have to make. You have to make alliances. You have to make relations with people to achieve a means. You see environmentalists doing this, I think sometimes to the point of exploitation of Native Americans or landowners for malicious intent. Sometimes it goes in the opposite direction. But then you see a lot of stakeholder relations between the hook and bullet crowd, private landowners, outfitters, energy development, grazing, ranching, farming, all these interests. You look at what transpired the last 4 years, and I'm not saying that Yellowstone perfectly mirrored the Biden administration, but a lot of the challenges and policy obstructions we saw were communicated through the program, especially in the last iteration. But I even think from the right, one of the warning signs that I hope Republicans, especially those who are going to be leading certain committees, people I like and respect but may have some disagreements on land issues, I really want to caution, and I think Yellowstone states this too, that there are certain things worth preserving, allowing for access, protecting family legacy, protecting public lands, making sure they're managed well and not abused by the federal government and sometimes even state governments. It's kind of a cautionary tale as to what you could lose when you say everything needs to be privatized or you have to return land to a state of wilderness. I think those are two extremes. And going forward, I think even conservatives understand that unlike any place in this world, we have beautiful public lands. Some are mismanaged. The national parks are crown jewels that people are envious of. They come here. We have lots of foreign tourists who come to our national parks. Some are not respectful, but I think a lot of them appreciate and can learn to love why the system is so good because of the North American model of wildlife conservation, because of typically what is, viewed as a good model of conservation that we've really nailed here in the United States, unlike the rest of the world. And even when accounting for government mismanagement and the need to improve and fix things, I don't think we want to have the other extreme either. Rewilding is really problematic, and I also think this insistence to sell public lands to the private interests to develop affordable housing or whatever so-called goal freedom cities, even if you are frustrated with the federal government, I think with the second Trump administration coming in, you could fix a lot of the problems. When we had the first Trump administration, a lot of those problems were resolved. So I think Yellowstone is a cautionary tale, even from the right, about safeguarding things, not wanting to make public lands just a plaything for those who are affluent and wealthy, because when you get rid of those public areas, it's increasingly hard to get them back. And a lot of people out west rely on these corridors, pathways, opportunities that are frequently not found here on the eastern United States. Like, they really have a luxury, and a lot of people don't want to see that eroded or destroyed because some people have an axe to grind, rightfully so, with the federal government. But I think if you reform government and reform these agencies to follow their mission statement as they need to, I think a lot of these problems can be resolved. But again, I think the show contextualizes the value of advancing true conservation, where you balance the interests of everyone involved. You make sure that no one interest has dominance, so to speak, that the preservationists do not have a monopoly over conservation issues because they intentionally mislead and solely what conservation is. And then you also don't have this insistence on making everything privatized, because we have a lot of private property, and private property is foundational to this country. But we also have a need, and we've also recognized that we need to have public lands because we want to protect and safeguard things. We don't want a 30 by 30 proposal or 30 by 30 agenda like the Biden administration has done, because that's an extreme position. But I don't think we want to see an even stronger minority position, which could catch mainstream. But I don't think even most conservatives and Republicans support privatizing all public lands. It's a pretty bipartisan ideal to keep public lands in public hands. You have to just return those to the people and make sure that public access is safeguarded. So I think there are lots of nuances, lots of different themes. And of course, who could forget the different iconic scenes, of Kevin Costner's one-liners about "This is America, we don't share our private land." I'm paraphrasing that. Then also the paradoxes highlighted about how bad clean energy projects are. That famous scene when he just became governor and really skewered his so-called advisor, saying, how could you protect sage grouse habitat if you're going to build solar panels on top of it? Which a lot of people, especially environmentalists, don't know how to grapple with. Such a perspective that they are fine with going through more hoops and jumping through more hoops to say they're going green, being supportive of clean energy, and then they're ultimately doing more ruin to the environment under so-called clean energy directives. So I will miss that very much from Yellowstone. I think shows like Landman will carry the mantle for however long that is going to run. And there's also, of course, the 1923 spinoff, where I think the second season where we will see this communicated more, but it's the end of an era. I'm very saddened by it. And if you want to see the public policy parallels, I recommend reading a December 2021 issue from PERCS magazine, the Property and Environment Research Center. I'll link to a lot of this that I've mentioned in the show notes for you if you're curious about kind of like the real world applications. I wrote a little bit about it, I think, for different Substacks and Town Hall articles, but I will include any relevant materials in the show notes. Now to this discussion about Canada versus Poland. I'm going to try to keep this a little shorter because I get very animated about Yellowstone, and I was very peeved when I saw this so-called right-wing influencer trash the show and just not understand what the intention behind the program was. So I got a little carried away with that. But we're going to keep this segment of the program today shorter. So, tale of two countries. Looking from the outside into two countries, our neighbors to the north and Poland, which I'm not Polish, but I have a lot of friends who are of Polish ancestry. I first visited the country this year. I loved my time in Poland this past October when I went on a reporting trip there. It was very familiar to me. As someone with Lithuanian heritage, there's a lot of similarities between the two cultures. Of course, they're two distinctive cultures, languages. But like Lithuania, and I think anyone who has Eastern European heritage compared to Western Europe, if you look at Eastern Europe, there's more of a reverence for a gun culture or for civilian ownership of firearms than you would find in Western Europe and even that of Canada. So I want to highlight specifically a video report that came out from Poland, and then we'll contrast it with what is transpiring in Canada and why I think Canada's direction is bad and why I like Poland's direction and much prefer that and hope to see more countries go in that direction. So a DW report, and this is, I think, German national TV, but it's a really renowned, well-known news outlet. I first caught whiff of this from the Visegrad 24 account, which is a news outlet run by a Polish gentleman who follows Central Eastern European issues. And sometimes he comments on American politics, sometimes even the crazy climate stuff, interestingly enough, but mostly world and current affairs. And he seems to have a really good read on public policy. And I saw this interview through his account, this Visegrad 24 account, and was really curious about this. And I wrote this a little bit more of a deep dive at my Substack newsletter. And here's kind of what I summarize. Poland is reportedly the first European Union nation to mandate firearms training for school children. Per DW, these firearm courses will be compulsory for primary school children in preparation of a potential Russian attack. And under the video summary, it says, firearms lessons are now compulsory for school children even at a young age. This is how Poland is preparing itself for a potential Russian attack. The children are enjoying it and their parents feel proud. So why is this relevant to American audiences or to my show? I'm going to explain why as best as I can. So from a comparative view, we are really lucky here to have a Second Amendment. Most of the world, including in more pro-gun or pro-civilian firearms ownership countries like Poland, Lithuania, Czech Republic, where it's not anathema to own a gun. It's just really difficult to obtain one. You have to have a license just to even merely own a firearm, which is ridiculous from an American standpoint. But that's what a lot of the people there, friends of mine who have guns in Eastern Europe, have had to do. They've had to go through so many hoops just to even simply own a handgun. And I think in Poland, I was reading somewhere that they're a little more liberal and lenient with the type of firearms you can own, but you have to join like a shooting sports organization. There's so many different like hoops and jumps. And from what I'm reading, you need a sporting license. In Poland, you have to join a shooting club or shooting association. You have to have a 3-month probationary period to get trained to know how to use firearms. If you pass that 3-month threshold, then you become a full member and do an exam for a shooting patent. And then you apply for the sporting license. You have to take part in a shooting competition, medical check, and all that. And then there's a firearms collector license, which is even more arduous. Then there's a training firearms license if you want to have this, if you want to own and operate a firearms, outfit. For self-defense license, you need a written and practical exam run by the county police, medical check. You have to explain why you need a firearms license for self-protection. We don't need to justify in the United States in most circumstances because we've had court cases decide for us saying that you don't need to prove or have a burden of proof of why you need to own a firearm. Although in certain blue states and municipalities, this is still the case. And then in Poland, you also need to get a potential hunting firearms license. So many licenses beyond like what we view as licenses here. Yes, you have to prove your competency for hunting and for your concealed carry, but in states where you don't need a concealed carry, you still have to go through competency. I think that's a given. But people criticize our concealed carry reciprocity laws or permitless carry laws and say, well, it can be the Wild West. It's going to be the Wild West. And so Europeans that I've spoken to have said that it's so much easier and it sounds more ideal and there's a lot more trust placed in America to own firearms rather than, the hoops and jumps that they go through in places like Poland. But in Poland, they are very much aware of the threats posed by Russia still. And if you think that Russia is not a threat, you don't really have an understanding of the dynamics and situation at play in Eastern Europe and how much they meddle, especially with them working with China. And we see this in the energy question too, that both of those countries are able to get away with environmental despoiling. And then they fund a lot of the anti-fossil fuel campaigns here in the United States, but that's besides the point. But Poland recognizes, its history and that it can't really leave matters into other people's hands. And I think that is why you're seeing these courses start to pop up. In the United States, we would say, well, because we're more laissez-faire, we can't mandate these courses. And I don't necessarily think you need to mandate this, but you can make it optional. And with it being optional, you're going to have such a big draw to these programs that people will request that they become part of the curriculum. And I don't know if we'd ever see that kind of flourish again. We used to have these courses here. Again, I'm first generation American. I don't have any context or proximity to any of those courses, but I've had friends from more rural parts of the country say that this is still a common practice. In Alaska, they teach kids how to do hunting and shooting courses in primary school in parts of the South, the Midwest, Mid-Atlantic. But I think up until recently, until maybe like the 1990s, this used to be commonplace, and it's less common now. So it's not out of left field to see Poland do this, and they could work on the video. It showed that there was a little bit of some handling of firearms that could be improved and tweaked upon, because there was actually a video circulated a few weeks ago on social media that showed that a shooting sports instructor in Poland shot someone. So they need to remember to have all the safeguards and the protections and the right protocol in place so they don't have any misfiring or mishandling of firearms. But in the demonstration in this video, the kids were not handling live bullets. They were not shooting with live bullets, rather, but more so laser targets, which is a great thing to do if people are concerned about, handling of live ammunition. You do that at the range. You don't do that at the school. So I thought that was fine, and that's a reasonable thing to do. And does this catch on in the rest of Europe? Does this lead them to adopt some sort of Second Amendment? I'm not so sure, because of the pull of the European Union, the European Commission. And even with these programs, firearms ownership in Europe is very paltry and small compared to us. Maybe, according to most recent figures, only 25 million Europeans across the 27 member states own firearms for personal uses, mostly for hunting. Europeans cite a different reason, largely going hunting as a reason to own firearms, but different countries actually state that self-defense is their primary motivation for owning a firearm. And we have, I think, close to 400 million lawful firearms in circulation, and our ratio of number of guns to people is pretty high. And that's why we are generally seen as a more safe country. Everyone's like, oh my gosh, all these, incidences and mass shootings. But compared to the rest of the world, we are a generally safer country. Even with the surge in gang violence and violent crime that has been happening in cities, coincidentally, in places where there is a lot of gun control policies. Not coincidence, actually. So in the areas where you see a lot of crime, you don't see much of a corresponding high rate of firearms ownership, because that's intentional. Let's compare this with what Canada is doing. I know there's not a direct connection between these two countries, although Canada has accepted a lot of Eastern European refugees at the height of the Soviet Union. And it's kind of lost its way in terms of leadership. Like I said, we may be seeing Justin Trudeau, who is very tyrannical in terms of his premiership, very anti-gun, very anti-hunting. I've spoken with different Canadians who've said that they want to receive refugee asylum in the United States because of just Canada's atrocious gun laws and other wayward policies that they have. But he has really taken drastic, extreme measures to control the flow of lawful firearms ownership. And if I understand correctly from what reports have said, he's banned over 2,000 different kinds of firearms, including commonly owned hunting rifles, which would be deemed perfectly lawful here in the United States. You wouldn't even see gun controllers pursue the prohibition of these guns. But if you give them enough ammunition, no pun intended, to ban guns, we have American gun controllers who would do the same thing. But even this is a bridge too far for them. But 2,000 firearms makes, including those that are semi-automatic, lawfully acceptable, non-assault weapon gun makes, have been prohibited. The first such measure, according to the Associated Press, take it for what you will, but they actually had very good reporting. Earlier this month, the Canadian government banned 324 other types of firearms, saying that guns belong on the battlefield, not in the hands of hunters or sports shooters. Ottawa, which is like their equivalent of Washington, D.C., their capital. So the reason why they're banning these 300 plus additional firearms is to transfer these guns that will be prohibited and therefore confiscated, to send them over to Ukraine to support their effort against Russia after Russia illegally invaded Ukraine. And as someone who supports Ukrainian autonomy and wants Ukraine to prevail, even with the problems of corruption and just you take out the leadership, morally speaking, as someone who had family endure Russian atrocities and whatnot, I'm sympathetic to the plight of Ukrainians. I thought it was horrible that they were invaded multiple times since the post-Soviet time frame. And I think they have a right to self-determination. They should have a Second Amendment. They should be able to arm themselves. But gun controllers exploiting the plight of Ukrainians and saying, okay, we will confiscate 300 some odd types of gun varieties from lawful Canadians, send them over to Ukraine. This is extremely egregious. You can separate these two issues, and the Canadian government doesn't look good whatsoever in these instances. And then one of their officials was like, every bit of assistance we can offer to the Ukrainians is one step towards their victory. So you believe in arming Ukrainians while also disarming your own people, Canadians. That makes no sense to me. That's cognitive dissonance. Why would you support? So you support the Second Amendment of Ukrainians, but not that of your own people. I think that's such a wrong-headed view in that respect. And like I said, I won't go into detail as to what types of guns are prohibited, but from what I had been told and from what Canadians have told me, your basic hunting rifle, semi-automatic in nature, not assault or fully automatic in nature, but commonly owned firearms, like the hunting rifle your grandpa or a relative may have handed down to you, that firearm is not safe if you're a Canadian. And we really, really avoided such a similar fate with the election of Donald Trump back to office. And granted, he was not perfect on firearms. I think since he almost was assassinated, he has taken a rightful approach in saying, I'm not going to ban the guns. It's the individual who was responsible for that. You would think he would have had that sort of 180 change in view, but no, he was like, the Second Amendment's not to blame. It's just this evil person who was targeting me. He had the issue with the bump stock stuff. Not perfect. They could have had a better ATF director. I'm not sure who he's selecting. I have not seen a selection or a nomination or a likely nominee for ATF director yet. I don't know if that's going to stand. With Doge talks, do we need an ATF? Does it fall under some other different type of agency? But we're not going to see the wholesale confiscation or wholesale prohibition of firearms under a second Trump administration, because not only due to Second Amendment rights, but also, as we talk and articulate here at the podcast, how these monies from firearms, ammunition, and the like go back to conservation efforts. Could you imagine how many billions of dollars would be taken away from conservation? Canada does not have this system in place. I don't think Poland and many other Western countries or even Eastern European countries have this system in place where we tie excise taxes and the monies generated from that, from firearms and ammunition primarily, and also hunting and fishing licenses, boating equipment, and the like, under Pittman Robertson, Dingell Johnson. This is also an added bonus, and it doesn't detract from the Second Amendment, of course, but this is a system in place which we devised to ensure that we have funding in perpetuity of these timeless activities. Canada does not have a Pittman Robertson or Dingell Johnson law, to my knowledge, and gun control indirectly would defund, or actually directly, I should correct myself, will directly defund conservation programs here in the United States. I've made this argument and this case very frequently, and even progressives who don't like guns have even recognized that if you stymie the flow or stymie gun rights here in this country, you're going to cut off a huge chunk of conservation funding that is annually dispersed back to the states, billions of dollars. It's usually close into the neighborhood of $2 billion annually, adjusted for inflation. And you would be cutting off vital funding for conservation while also eroding the Second Amendment. So don't bite the hand that feeds you. Again, in Canada, Poland, and many other countries around the world, not only do they not have a Second Amendment, they don't have this conservation tie-in either, which is why our model here in the United States, whether it's for firearms ownership in the Second Amendment to the conservation system we have in place, we're the envy of the world. And if countries try to emulate us, even little by little, I like the direction Poland is going in. I don't know if they can change their constitution in the future, maybe liberalize their laws a little bit more. We saw Europe actually take a very interesting good stance on wolf management because for some reason it has to be a personal issue for the leaders for them to enact change. So Ursula von der Leyen, who's president of the European Commission, was very upset about her pony or some livestock of hers being attacked by a wolf. So she recommended and was able to get much of the European Commission, this governing body of the EU, to support deregulating the threatened status of the gray wolf or the European wolf. I think it was the gray wolf, but the wolf in Europe, the equivalent, I think, of what we have here in the States. I think it was the gray wolf because it was personal. It shouldn't have to take a personal situation to reform wildlife management laws or bring them into the modern times and not have too many restrictions because of just the conflicts that could be at play. But will it take some personal affliction to get the European Commission to change their laws, allow for Second Amendments? I'm not sure because that governing body is so steeped in gun control and they want to stymie the so-called trafficking of guns or selling of guns. They regulate it to oblivion. Like I said, you have to get a permit just to even own a gun, whether it's inside or outside of your house. We don't have to go through so many hurdles here in the United States, excluding some jurisdictions that make it increasingly difficult. But our courts have rectified the situation and said you are able to lawfully own a gun inside and outside of your house with a permit. But it's just these localities that refuse to enforce this. But if we're talking outside of the context of the United States, I think countries should become like Poland and less like Canada. If you enjoyed this installment of District of Conservation, I would love to know your feedback. Send it my way. Please be sure to leave us reviews on Apple, Spotify, or wherever podcasts are played, and also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to never miss a beat nor a guest announcement. Thanks so much for listening to District of Conservation. I hope you have a wonderful day. And please share the podcast to those who may be interested in learning more about these critical natural resources, environment, energy issues.